Therapy, a boutique in-home private pediatric speech, language, and dyslexia therapy practice serving families living in the mainline area from Ardmore to Melbourne, PA. They're dedicated to helping children's speech and communication skills develop and grow as they are essential to their academic and social success. Owls Therapy offers comprehensive evaluations and devises individual therapy plans that best match your child's personal needs. They also offer all therapy in-home, provide parent and teacher training, offer classroom observations, and help with navigating school-based services. Learn more at owlstherapy.com. Hello and welcome to Parenting Stuff I Wish I Knew Sooner and Want You to Know Now. I'm your host, Erica Desper, founder of the Center for Confident Parenting and a mom who seems to learn everything I need to know the hardest way and well after I need to know it. I'm on a mission to help you prevent the same experience. To that end, today I'm joined by Dr. Kathryn Snyder, a board-certified registered art therapist and licensed professional counselor with over 20 years experience and the founder and director of Parent to Child, a private clinical practice focused on creative arts therapies and speech and language therapy for individual adults, children, families, and teens. Dr. Snyder is also the founder and director of Spark, a school-based art therapy program, and mom to two children, ages 23 and almost 21. Dr. Snyder, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Erica. I'm so pleased to be here.
I'm happy to have you. So first, tell us a bit about yourself, your family, and what brought you to create these programs and offer this type of support.
Oh, yeah. It's been quite a journey. So I'll start by saying that I certainly have roots in my early family of origin experience, partly in this wistful time of growing up in a small town and on Sunday morning spending time copying comics out of the newspaper. I loved art from an early age, and I grew up surrounded by nature. So I had a lot of experiences in this imaginal culture where I was able to really grow my own sense of self. However, my parents also divorced when I was little. And so that early loss is certainly a factor in shaping who I am today. I knew from an early age that I wanted to be in the arts, but I also knew that I wanted to do it in a way that worked with people. I knew that I was very attentive to people around me and had a real sense of the emotional tone of my surroundings. So for a long time, I thought about being an art teacher, and that would have been wonderful. I also heard about art therapy when I was in college back in the 80s, and it was not so easy to find out information about any kind of practice beyond the kind of cut and dry offerings in your community. But I did have a college counselor who I met with as I was leaving college who also knew about art therapy. And that was back in the day when you looked up master's programs in books and found out where they resided and how to apply and what the what the acceptance rates were. And I grew up in Virginia and went to Virginia Tech for my undergraduate degree. And most of the programs were far from home. However, I also knew I wanted to live in a city. I'd grown up watching Sesame Street and dreamed of Mr. Hooper's store being part of my life.
Didn't we all?
Didn't we all? So for a few years, I moved to the DC area and I worked in the arts and had a really lovely time there, but also continued to have this itch. There is a graduate program at GW University in Washington, DC. But by that time, I was married to a Philadelphian. And so we moved to Philadelphia, and I went to what was then MCP Hahnemann, but it's now Drexel University. And I haven't looked back. I did my practicum and my internship experiences mostly with children and teens, and I've loved every minute of it. So I found myself right where I needed to be. As many of us in mental health, we start off working in larger organizations, which gave me a lot of opportunities for seeing children with a lot of different needs and a lot of different circumstances. My work at the time was in New Jersey at a time when the system, meaning the Division of Youth and Family Services, as it was called at the time, was under a lot of stress. A lot of things needed to change. And at the same time, I was having my own children. So I continued that work for several years and then found myself switching gears and moving into the private practice that I've developed today. I decided that I needed to work in an environment where I had a little bit more control over my schedule and my days. And I wanted to be rooted in Philadelphia, where I was raising my children and where there just weren't a lot of services that were accessible to the community. So that's how I began. And Parent to Child was born in
Wonderful.
2007. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. I know that you're providing something that so many need. So help us understand. Let's speak to the parent or person that has no idea what art therapy is. What
Mhm.
are we talking about?
Sure. So first, I like to say that it's really rooted in child development and person development. So children pick up tools of drawing and creating at about 18 months of age after they've been playing with their food and their toys. They really learn and they recognize that there are these things that people are using in the environment to make permanent marks. And it's really a reflection, along with play, of a child's learning experience. They are using these tools to show their agency and to show what they know and to put it into concrete form. So children are learning how to process not only their learning experiences, but also their emotional experiences through their art and play. That doesn't stop from those early years when children enter into school and they start to develop more of a linguistic and cognitive awareness and way of learning. In the early grades, teachers know that children need hands-on, sensory-based activities to really incorporate all that they're learning. So art therapy is rooted in the proposition that this is a primary way that we are not only learning about our experiences, which are both cognitive and emotional, but
Mhm.
then it is a release. It's an expressive format for processing and making sense of those experiences. So children can't come into a therapy experience and talk about their experiences right off the bat, and they
Mhm.
certainly can't do so for 45 minutes to an hour. They need an engaged process in order to really share their experiences and settle into and understand the emotional valence of it.
Mhm.
There are lots of different ways that we work in the arts. There are sensory and kinesthetic modalities where we're really maybe moving loose paint like finger paints around on a page. Sometimes we even start with pre-art materials like cotton balls and dried beans and rice, just like you would in a classroom.
Mhm.
And that might impact a child's way of, again, learning how to engage with materials, learning how to make sense of them. And it's really starting to tap into where their emotions and their understanding of their experience, their perceptual awareness lies. So by engaging in sensory experiences, we might start to then tap into that emotional valence and
Mhm.
then bring it to visual form where they can have more of a cognitive understanding of it. In art therapy, we might start at a cognitive awareness of things. So with older children who do have more language and the ability to really share what they are experiencing, we might start by having them draw some of their experiences, but then we want to tap into some of the emotional parts of their experiences so that that emotion doesn't get lost and so that they can incorporate it into their understanding of self and experience and have a better label for their emotional experiences. One of the things I say is that children need help in really identifying the nuances of emotions. We think that it's sort of inborn to start to label and understand emotional experiences, but it's really not. It takes a much more slowed down and nuanced approach to start to help kids and any of us really incorporate our emotional experiences, make sense of them, and really put a more accurate and refined label to that experience. So art therapy is predicated on the idea that by engaging in a symbolic and creative process, we can access that more easily.
Mhm.
We can refine it and come up with the terminology and the story that's a little bit more nuanced. And that all helps a child integrate that so that it's not just kind of floating around anxiously in their system.
Got it. Okay. So, what types of kids, scenarios, challenges, issues would be a good fit for art therapy? I mean, I'm sure you would say like everyone can benefit, and anyone who needs to process anything ever, right? But can you name some specific things that this tends to be an ideal fit for versus maybe talk therapy or
Of
in addition
course.
to?
Right. Right. And art therapists can work as a primary clinician with many kinds of needs. So, for instance, I say that I work with that kind of garden variety of emotional experience that children come in with. I work with a lot of children who are processing grief and loss, divorce, which comes with an emotional need. A child needs to understand what this experience is about and how they're feeling about it and what to do with those feelings. So that's sort of like this general sense of processing emotional experiences. There are also a lot of kids who experience anxiety and depression at early ages, whether or not that is related to an early loss or a big experience. And anxiety, especially in the early years, and again, we're talking about big picture issues, but things show up very differently in different developmental sectors, shall we say. So we might see a young child coming into our offices with a lot of big feelings. They're very reactive to things in their environment. Maybe they're very sensitive to things that are happening in their social realm at school or on the playground. And they need help in regulating those emotional experiences. That may be a child whose developmental integration is just sort of out of sync and they need a little bit of support. We
Mhm.
see a lot of that right now as we're trying to reconcile what kids experienced with COVID
Right.
and how they managed the experience of really being locked down and the anxiety of a real threat to health and safety, which also meant not only that general anxiety that was looming large in the environment, but also a limitation in terms of the exposure that children got to those natural ways that they learned to cope with the onslaught of sensory activity around them, the onslaught of social experiences that they would get on a day-to-day basis. Even going to the grocery store with a parent might be a normal activity, but it brings with it a lot of sensory motor activity that children build in terms of their emotional tolerance and resilience.
Mhm.
So we see a lot of big feelings that may just be normative and need a little bit of support in this, what I say is sort of like a developmental hiccup. Or it could relate to a child who is highly sensitive. Their nervous system is innately more sensitive to things around them, which may play out to be what we call anxiety at a later developmental time. So art therapy does really well with supporting that kind of emotional regulation and integration, as well as teaching kids how to cope. We use a lot of metaphors that help kids learn how to identify and manage those emotional sensitivities and needs. So that's another way that art
Yeah.
therapy works beyond the playing with materials. We would have them draw some of those coping strategies. I have kids draw uh, uh, clouds in the sky as a metaphor for thinking about things that can move and change quickly, right? So
Mhm.
I help them uh, imagine that those clouds in the sky are the ways in which their feelings might move quickly on a bright summer sunny day when the clouds are kind of puffy and moving around the sky really quickly.
Right.
So
Gotcha.
back
And
to
let
your
me pause you there for one
Mhm.
second. You mentioned highly sensitive um, kids. So a lot of the parents in our audience have kids who are neurodivergent or they're anticipating a diagnosis of
Mhm.
neurodivergence. So is this, I presume, this would be a great modality for them.
Mm, absolutely. And so not only for those sensitivities, those sensory and perceptual sensitivities, but then when it also falls into the categories of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, ADD, that continuum on the neurodivergent spectrum of things, and the autism spectrum.
Hmm.
We work really well supporting the emotional needs and the kind of uh, integrative functioning of children with those kinds of neurodivergent needs.
Right.
Yes,
And a lot of them do process in a more tactile way. I mean, it's not across
right.
the board, but I know mine does. So that
Correct.
it might be more effective just by nature of moving their body and manipulating the materials and all that good stuff. Thank you for
Exactly.
answering that. I think I threw you off though. You weren't finished what you were saying.
No, I think that's helpful. Yes. So we work really well with neurodivergent children and families. And I think that covers sort of the range of things. There are certainly things that we identify as we're working with children and families because there might be some presence of an emotional dysregulation or some anxieties. And there may be more things that are underneath. I'm thinking about some of the things that we don't work with as a primary clinician. So, if an anxiety falls into the bucket of obsessive compulsive disorder,
Mm-hmm.
and there are very specific things that children are avoiding, while we do a lot of parent support, we might also co treat or refer to specialists in that realm.
Okay, that's good to know. And as with any issue, it probably ends up often being a multidisciplinary. We need different people addressing it from different angles. Um, that was going
Absolutely.
to be my next question. Are there situations where you can't be, where art therapy wouldn't be ideal or couldn't be ideal in and of itself? I'm specifically wondering about trauma. Um, so can you speak to
Mm.
that?
So actually, trauma is one of the areas where we do really well, and I'm sorry that I neglected to mention that earlier.
That's all right. I got you covered. My
Thanks.
brain's
Yeah.
going very fast.
Yeah. Trauma is one of those areas where the trauma is not encoded in our brain linguistically. We might be able to tell the story to some degree of what happened, but the integration of the experience um, uh, is really helped by a visual and imaginal art therapy process
Hmm.
because so much of the trauma is encoded in the brain in sensory kinds of ways. What we where I say, and I'm speaking for myself, there are many art therapists practicing in lots of different ways. But for me, I think that there are times when obsessive compulsive disorder, when children are really tactile defensive,
Right.
that's an area where as a therapist, I know how to talk through with a child some of the things that they're going to need, but art therapy might not be the primary mode that's going to really support them. And
That makes
so
sense.
I may or may not continue to do the treatment.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Art
are there
therapists
sorry, go ahead.
no, art therapists work with a lot of different populations beyond children and teens. I do a lot of family work in the art therapy realm as well as parent support
That's what
verbally.
that was where I was going.
Oh, okay.
Are there parent scenarios that come to you that like maybe the kid specifically or individually isn't having the hard time, but it's more of the parents need coaching or the family needs some improvement in their dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what I'll say to start is from the art therapy realm, I love to do family sessions using art, especially as I'm getting to know a family as they're starting to identify the patterns of relatedness that are challenged.
Hmm.
And so by putting those dynamics into visual form, that can be enacted around the art table, right? Those dynamics of communication, those dynamics of who relies on whom, or how does each person relate to different types of demands or their relationships. So art therapy can be a really wonderful way to explore and really see those kinds of dynamics emerge. It can also be a great way to help families problem solve along the way of learning how to communicate differently, learning how to
Hmm.
problem solve, learning how to cope and manage different things that are coming up. So, in that regard, in my practice, that's often used in conjunction with a talk family therapy model.
Hmm.
Although I also say that if a child is in the room, we need to have some art and play supplies available as well. That's where
Sure.
the child really finds their voice and
Mhm.
finds their comfort as we are talking about uncomfortable, challenging material.
Yeah, which brings me to my next question. You mentioned one reason this may be beneficial is just how the experiences are encoded. Maybe a child can't access them in a language way, but in an image
Right.
way. Would another um, scenario be that, let's say you have a teen who's just completely resistant to talk therapy? They can
Mhm,
access it. They just don't. They don't want to talk about it
mhm.
verbally because it is so uncomfortable. Maybe they just struggle with hard conversations. So, could art therapy be an
Yeah,
avenue for like a resistant child?
absolutely. So I think we see that a lot. And even though some of our teens may still also be resistant to some of the processes in art therapy, they find that it's much more safe and comfortable, and it allows for a lot of quiet and silence.
Mm.
So they feel more supported in that sense that they don't have to reveal everything right away. They don't have to address it right away.
Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. What, how young could a child be to benefit from art therapy? Are we
Mhm.
looking at a range or is it just anybody? Anybody that can hold a art supply?
So certainly, the younger the child, the more additional family and parent supports we utilize and incorporate. I say, generally speaking, at my practice, I started about age 4.
Okay.
And that's just my preference. I really love 3.5, 4 year olds, and we move on up that developmental ladder.
Mhm.
When there is a trauma with a younger child, going through a specific art therapy protocol is really wonderful. And I have done that with 2.5, 3 year olds, even though they're not drawing human figures and other recognizable forms yet. By engaging them in a scribbling process and talking through what the story is, we can really help them integrate those kinds of traumas. When I experience or have a referral for a younger child, again, I'm listening for how much parent support should I be incorporating. There's a lot of good work doing dyadic art therapy with younger children and their primary caregivers, again, to
Okay.
support that emotional learning, but in the context of that parent support. And that's how I handle those referrals for the most part.
Okay.
There are art therapists that are working within centers like the Center for Autism.
Mhm.
And so they're going to see younger children on site, but that's going to be part of an inclusive school-based type of environment.
Okay. And then there's no maximum, but
No
the
maximum.
elderly could benefit from art therapy.
Absolutely. And I was just speaking to students. I was guest lecturing a class last week, and I think that as people get older, what I say is, adults can benefit from maybe they really want to engage in art therapy. It feels like a type of therapy that would really help them. And that is certainly welcome. I think oftentimes it's also a really profound and wonderful process in co treatment when different things are coming up that somebody is trying to process in their verbal therapy, but it's not accessed as easily. And so I love doing that type of collaborative work. And as people are aging, I think they start to lean into the creative parts of themselves that became neglected.
Hmm.
And art therapy with older adults can help with a lot of memory consolidation and memory care, reminiscing about their past, as well as integrating some of their past experiences.
Hmm.
And the fine motor aspects of art making can really support the fine motor, the ways in which people are losing those fine motor skills.
Right,
And
right.
so it's really wonderful in elder care.
And we didn't stress this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this art therapy is about the process, not the product. So if someone's like, well, I stink at art, it's like, we're not here to make
Yes,
masterpieces, right? Yeah.
exactly. Absolutely. And I stress that at all ages, that it's much more
Mhm.
about the process. And when people start to gain in their mastery of the materials, we love it when they feel pride in their work and feel like they are starting to see more, I'm going to say beauty, and I use that expansively, but beauty in their making.
Yeah,
But the primary emphasis is on the process for sure.
got it. So I'm sure this varies depending on the age, but what might a session look like? You kind of touched on
Mhm.
this. What might it consist of if a parent is just trying to picture, like, is this kind of therapy really viable for us? Will my
Mhm.
kid join in?
Yeah. So I say to parents when they call, and again, my practice mostly focuses on our sweet spot is those younger ages. We have a lot of teens in our practice, and so what I'm going to start to talk about is those younger children where there is going to be much more of a family parent support element, and then I'll say what's different about what a session might look like with a teenager,
Sure.
where I still want to emphasize family communication and support, but the parents are, and the teen needs the parents to move out of the realm of kind of overseeing what's happening in the experience. So for younger children, um, parents come into the room with the child at the beginning of every session and we do a check in. And so I want the child to start to be able to reflect on what their week was like, some of the things that were challenging, some of the things that are bringing them into treatment. And we break down that um, self consciousness around that being bad behavior. Right. So we really reframe that and help children hear that there are sometimes moments when they are dysregulated or having a tough time managing their experiences and that it becomes disruptive to them and others around them. And that's what we want to help their system accommodate to. So we do a check in and we kind of raise that anxiety just a little bit. We're talking about the tough stuff. And again, that could be a variety of things depending on what we're talking about. I'm talking about mostly that kind of experience where we have a lot of kids coming into our offices with those big emotions related to many diagnostic categories. So we touch on those challenging moments and we start to again put some words and language around what might have been happening, what they might be experiencing and what some of those feelings are, as well as how to problem solve, right? We want to engage that cognitive process while we're still raising up some of that affect, that feeling state around things. I also want kids to hear that there's room to tell me what some of their triumphs were from the week. What were some moments that they handled really well, or some things that they just had a really good time doing? I want them to language things, but I also know that they're not going to be forthcoming right away. And so their parent is that auxiliary ego that
Right.
helps to kind of put a frame around what they're working on and what they're thinking about. So the parent is involved not only in the telling and starting to feel safe in the telling, and then we're all problem solving together. Sometimes that can be thinking about um, bedtime routines and regulating those kinds of things, and sometimes it's problem solving around how they're feeling in really big tough moments and how they can plan and do different things ahead of time as well as in those moments to self-soothe and cope and manage. So
Got it.
we do this check-in time for about the first 10 minutes. I say to parents, I don't want to overwhelm the child. We're not going through the laundry list of experiences from the week, but we want to touch on a few key points so that we are starting to develop that shared language and that understanding and helping the child feel more comfortable in talking about those tough moments. Then we send the parent out to the waiting room. And my office is set up with, a couch and a chair, like a therapy office. And then there's an area where there's a play space. So there are bookshelves that are filled with toys. There's a child-sized table where the art supplies are located. And every week is going to look a little bit different depending on what the needs are that are coming up. So there might be a week where I've heard something during that talk time and I say, I've got a metaphor. Let's draw a story about what happened, and let's think through some key points, and think about how we can use the art for problem solving. Other times, and most often, I let the child move into that space and make their own choices and selections. That's often reflective of what feelings are bubbling up from that talk time. They might choose things that help them self-soothe and self-structure. They might choose things that really get that affect out in profound ways. But they start to learn the space. They start to learn the different ways that the tools work. So there's a very big difference between drawing using markers and crayons and pencils versus taking paper and tearing it up and making a collage versus taking paint and making a painting. So again, sometimes we, the therapist, are really promoting those experiences as we're gauging what's coming into the room and what's bubbling up for the child. But we're often trying to encourage the child to think about what they need and self-select and move through art and play experiences that really reveal and release what they're experiencing. We play the role of the guide, really reflecting the affect that's showing up, starting to help a child put words to their experiences, and really tuning into what they're feeling and how to better regulate that. We always close up by helping a child do that kind of reflection. That can be through labeling what they've made, labeling what they've done, giving it a name, or telling the story, but also reflecting back on what we started talking about and how we have seen that kind of show up in the room. Again, sometimes, that's very much guided by us saying, ooh, it seems like that wasn't easy to talk about today. And then you took the markers and you were really scribbling on that page. I wonder if that was helpful. So we might really offer that kind of reflection to build that vocabulary with the child.
Well, it sounds
And then
amazing.
what I say to parents
I
is
want to
I'm
go
going to
to it
bring
right
them
now.
back out to the yeah. And then we bring the child back to the waiting room and we ask parents that we don't really label the experience as, did you have fun?
How was it, right?
But we send the child home and we've kind of closed up that affective moment. And then, we'll follow up with parents through a quick email or through our client portal with any important information that they need to know, but they've also heard earlier in the session some of those coping strategies and some of the language that we're building to help children self-regulate better.
Excellent. And if a situation called for it, it sounds like you typically are seeing kids once a week. Do you ever
Yes.
build a program that starts off with more frequency and more intensity and then sort of taper down, or is it always like a weekly modality?
I would say that it's not common to have more intensity, although it does happen for sure. For sure. There are certainly cases where maybe it's seeing the child once a week and maybe seeing the parents once a week, or maybe it's seeing the child twice a week. Sometimes I push into schools, so I might see the child in my office once a week, and then I might see them at school once a week, depending on what the need is.
Gotcha.
Sometimes child behaviors aren't showing up at school, so
Right.
that's rare, but maybe that's not the primary point of focus or the primary area where things need to be supported. But there are many cases where those systems, those two areas of a child's life, home and school, are very much lively, shall we say? And so I love pushing into schools and supporting supporting the coping strategies there and helping
And you
kids
offer
know that too.
groups as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you want to touch on those?
Yeah, absolutely. So for years, I've done social skills groups with kids. So again, supporting kids in accessing the cognitive language around skill development with friends, right? What's expected and unexpected in different social situations. And once again, I think the important key to that is finding a child-friendly and very safe place and way for them to do that. So smaller groups, when kids are struggling out on the playground or even in their classrooms, having 3 or 4 other kids in a group is a safer way to start to explore those social skills. And using art and play, and for social skills, that can be game play more than imaginative play, but also the skills of individual art making as well as group art making can really foster that development really nicely and really complement that cognitive social learning piece. Over the years, I've also done a lot of just emotional processing groups that tends to happen around middle school where those needs become much more apparent rather than their world focusing on the social skills per se. And so we do a lot with art therapy to help children learn about those emotional regulation tools, how to express themselves more effectively. Of course, that does spill into their social world, but the primary focus is how they're understanding their emotional selves and that identity development and formation. So we do a lot of small group work using art therapy modalities, but also, again, skill building and helping kids talk about their experiences.
Awesome. All right. Now I can kind of picture what this would consist of and who it can benefit. And I hope everybody else can too. Before I let you go, let's move from your clinician um, hat and back to just your mom hat. As I mentioned at the outset, you have two young adult children. What is one thing that you've learned on your own parenting journey that we haven't talked about yet that you really want other parents who are maybe earlier on or approaching that stage to hear and know today?
Yeah. I think for me, really understanding that emotional health and wellness starts young and um, kids have such a rich inner life, and it's really challenging to grow those social and emotional skills and the resilience that we really want them to have. And so, really tuning in and supporting them at those young ages is just such a gift. It really sets them up for success at the later stages. And I think to that end, saying, don't be afraid to ask for help.
Right. Because we
We
don't have to do that by ourselves, right? We
we
shouldn't
don't
have
have to.
to.
That's right. That's right. And I really wish we could just have a world that was much more open about the variety of therapies that any of us can benefit from at different times of our lives, and that we saw it as something that we tap into at various stages and in different ways. There are lots of forms of therapy that we can benefit from, and I think that really not being afraid to ask for that help and to sit in that vulnerability. I know how challenging it is. And I also know how wonderful it is in the end for all of us involved.
Yeah, awesome. Dr. Snyder, thank you so much for joining me. I will let everyone know how they can find you and your center in the description of this episode. Watchers, listeners, I'll be back soon with more stuff that I and others wish that we knew sooner. I want you to know as soon as possible. In the meantime, I'll leave you with my list of stuff, a few things on my list that I've learned the hardest way. Your to-do list will always be there, so make sure you put yourself on it. You can't pour from an empty cup, so schedule ways to refill yours every day. And there's no way to be a perfect parent, countless ways to be a really good one. And we don't have to do that alone. We'll add on for today. Thank you so much. And I will be back soon with more.